This video is sponsored by Brilliant.org. Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek here and welcome back to the channel. So from the video title and or thumbnail, you will have seen that I have taken over 1,000 pictures of the Seven Sisters, or basically the Pleiades star cluster / Diminishing Nebula. So obviously this is for astrophotography. And why did I take so many images, so many pictures of that same target could be your question if you're new to astrophotography. So we're going to get into those details in this video, and we'll also compare the results when I use just one of those images compared to, let's say, 64 or 128 or 512, all the way up to above 1,000 images together, and show you how it changes how much details I can get out of my image. And this video might get a little bit long, potentially, I'm not sure, I don't really have a script, but if it does, I'll make sure to have chapters down below so you can skip to the juicy parts if you're not interested in the super interesting stuff prior to those juicy parts. And you definitely want to stay tuned to see the actual results on the final image, because I have some really cool comparisons coming up. So first things first, we'll go to the title of the video immediately. Why have I taken over 1,000 images of the same target, the Pleiades, or Seven Sisters, or Subaru in Japanese? Yes, the Subaru car brand with its logo with stars in it is exactly that target. And really the main reason is simply because the Pleiades has some very faint nebulosity around the main stars of the star cluster, and I want to capture that nebulosity. But that nebulosity is so faint, it's so dim, that I need to take a very, very long exposure to capture as much details from that faint nebulosity as I can. But the problem is I'm not really able to capture such a very, very long exposure at one time. And there's multiple reasons for that. One reason is simply that I live in Tokyo, Japan. So we'll be able to see the results that I get from a very light polluted city, but the light pollution of the Tokyo city makes very long exposures impossible. The reason being that if I leave my camera sensor pointed at the Pleiades for, let's say, 1 hour, even just 1 hour at a time, then the light pollution is so bright effectively that it will completely saturate my sensor. So I'll just end up with a white image that doesn't have any details whatsoever. And there's other very practical reasons as well. The Earth is rotating. When I want to take a very long exposure of a target in the sky, I need to counter the rotation of the Earth, right? So that I keep the target steady in my field of view, so my camera sensor is always on target. And that process, as simple as it sounds, is actually really, really difficult. And anything such as wind, or just me stepping right next to the telescope on my balcony, can completely waste my exposure, because it makes the tracking worthless and my image will be all blurry with star streaks and all that kind of horrible stuff. And then there's another reason. On very, very faint targets, I want to take a lot of exposure time. Like I want to take maybe 20 hours of exposure time, but the night doesn't last that long, right? Unless you're like at the poles. And that's something that I know confuses a lot of people when they look at like a Hubble image, and the Hubble image is saying the Hubble telescope spent 24 hours imaging this target. And we're like, wait, how? And the answer is, instead of taking a super long exposure, we're going to take many short exposures, and we're just going to add them together at the end to get the same result. Or instead of adding them, we can average them, but it's kind of the same thing, because averaging is adding and then dividing. It's roughly the same. And then we get into a topic that confuses a lot of beginning astrophotographers and even advanced ones from time to time, which is, wait, you can take many short exposures, add them to one another, and you'll have the same result as a single long exposure? What about super faint areas that I wasn't even able to detect in a short exposure? It doesn't matter how many short exposures I'm going to take. The small faint areas, I'll never get them, because I didn't get them in any of my exposures, right? That is a very logical thing to think. And I'm going to give a very typical example, which is, you can imagine that your camera sensor is just an array of buckets. So I have tons of little buckets, one like next to one another, arranged in an array of pixels. So each of my pixels is a bucket. But because I'm taking this camera sensor into the field, my buckets are necessarily small, right? I have small buckets and they cannot contain that much water, or in our case, that many photons. So, because I know that, I can arrange to have in a warehouse somewhere very large buckets, also arranged matrix pattern, just like the camera sensor, and we'll have exactly the same number of very huge buckets with the same arrangement as we have this very small buckets. So what happens is I can take my array of small buckets, so my camera sensor, into the rain, and that rain represents effectively photons falling out of the sky from the target that we want to image. And then I can cover my small buckets. That's the camera shutter. And then I open it for 1 hour, and if I open it for 1 hour, my bucket will overflow. This is the saturation of the sensor that I mentioned earlier in the video. So what I can do instead is I open my shutter, like I remove the cover, I wait 10 seconds, and then I close the cover, and then I manually take each of my little tiny buckets from my camera, and I go and pour the contents into the huge buckets I have in my warehouse back there, right? And then I bring back my now empty tiny buckets, and I put them back into the matrix that we have in the field to capture the rain of photons. I do that for each and every of my tiny buckets. I empty them into the corresponding huge bucket in the warehouse. And then, okay, I'm still covered, and then I open again 10 seconds, so light accumulates in my tiny buckets, and I close the cover again, and I repeat that. And what's happening when I do that is I take the small amount of water that I received in each of my tiny buckets, and I just add it to my huge buckets that also contain the small amount of water that we took from the last exposure. And because photons, just like rain, they kind of fall randomly, they do have some kind of average, like we can expect maybe 8 photons per hour on this particular bucket. But it means that this statistics is always true, and by just doing this like exposure after exposure process, and each time we're going to go and take those tiny buckets and pour them into the huge buckets, it works exactly as if we were able to take the huge buckets and put them on the field and have a 10-hour exposure without worrying about saturating those buckets because they're so huge. There are some caveats to that. For instance, like when I take my tiny bucket and I go and transfer the water into the huge bucket, I might like still leave a little film of water inside, right? There's some stiction. The water, a little bit of water stays in my tiny bucket, right? So I haven't collected all of the water from my tiny bucket to put it into the large bucket. And this is actually a very good analogy for something in photography that we call the read noise. And the read noise is the main culprit that makes that tons of short exposures are not quite exactly the same as a single long exposure. But it's extremely close because as you can see, effectively, because I'm just collecting my rain 10 seconds at a time, and then I'm just like transferring each time to very large bucket, we effectively get the same result as if I had taken this array of very large buckets and put it under the rain for longer. And by taking those small buckets and each time emptying them into the larger buckets, effectively the larger buckets, each bucket in the large bucket array contains the sum of the amount of rain that was collected by the corresponding tiny bucket across multiple exposures. So we've added exposures together. And that is what we call stacking in astrophotography. Stacking is the method by which, when you've taken like 1,000 images of a target, just like I did for Subaru for the Pleiades, you can then just add all of those images together. And then for convenience sake, we just like divide by the number of images. So we just like normalize, we just take an average, but it's exactly the same as adding. And then we end up with an image that approximates extremely closely a single long exposure. And I find this absolutely amazing. Now, there is some other stuff that is amazing about doing that. And that has to do with noise in an image. What we're doing when you're taking a very, very long exposure like that by effectively taking many short exposures, it's you're collecting signal from your target. I'm collecting signal from the Seven Sisters, from the Pleiades. But at the same time, I am collecting photons from light pollution. And also, there is some variance. In one exposure, I might have collected like maybe 8 photons from my target and 50 from light pollution in one of my pixels. But then the next exposure, which was exactly the same time, I only have 7 photons from my target, and instead of 50, I have 44 photons from light pollution. And this is because even though we have an average rate of photons falling onto our sensor, for example, 8 photons per hour or 50 photons per hour, depending on the source, for each exposure, there's a bit of randomness that's going on there. And that randomness makes each of my short exposures different than all of my other short exposures. And it's because each of my short exposures are very different than all of the others, because of that randomness, that when we add them together, the impact of the randomness is minimized. It becomes smaller and smaller because we're averaging out, or we're adding out the small randomness component. And there comes something that is, even that I find still mind-boggling right now. It has to do with the way that photons, or rain for that matter, it's the same principle, falls onto a camera sensor. It follows, I'm going to go a little bit into statistics, but not too much into details, don't worry. But it follows what we call a Poisson distribution. And it so happens that the randomness of such a distribution, like the signal that falls from the sky onto our camera sensors, is equal to the square root of that signal. And effectively, that randomness is the noise for our images. So what's happening is, if I take 4 exposures, and I compare those 4 exposures to 16 exposures, 4 times as many exposures, I will have increased the signal that I have captured 4 times, right? Because I took 4 times more exposure, from 4 to 16 exposures. But at the same time, the noise element is the square root. So while I have increased my signal by a factor of 4, I've also increased my noise by a factor of 2. Which means that my signal to noise ratio has been doubled. If I want to double my signal to noise ratio, I need to take 4 times more exposures. So if I've taken 5 exposures of the Pleiades and I want to double my signal to noise ratio, I need to take an additional 12 to end up with 4 times more exposures. It's as simple as that. When you're doing astrophotography, or it can even work for like nighttime landscape photography if you're interested in trying it out. If you want to increase your signal to noise ratio, which basically makes your image less noisy, and you want to make it twice less noisy, effectively, kind of, then you want to quadruple your exposure time. So have taken 4 times more frames, or 4 times more exposure time. And it's as simple as that. And logically, you would think like, hey, just doubling the exposure time or doubling the number of exposures that I've taken should be enough. And it's not true. If you just double the exposure time, or you double the number of exposures you've taken, which is the same thing assuming all of the exposures have the same length, you are increasing your signal to noise ratio by a factor of square root of 2, so 1.41 something. And I find that absolutely amazing. And what is going to be awesome is that I will show you in practice how it looks like on the Pleiades star cluster and its surrounding emission nebula from a super light polluted city like Tokyo in Japan. But before we get there, if you were confused by all of my talk about signal to noise ratio and probability, and probably it's because like your math teacher in high school was bad, or they didn't get you hooked on mathematics, and you want to catch up to that, you want to learn math and science and physics, or computer science on all of those domains, and you're wondering how to catch up, what is the best way to learn math, science, computer science, and I'm here to tell you that it is brilliant.org. Brilliant is an awesome tool that I use almost every single day to really catch up on my knowledge of math and science, or in this case, probabilities. And it works super well because it has tons of courses available across many levels. So you can be a complete beginner and Brilliant will have a course for you. And those courses, they're not just like super dense and difficult to understand, they're interactive as much as possible. So you can gain an intuitive understanding of what you're trying to learn. And at the same time, you never get bored because they add tons of new courses every month. Plus, one thing that I really love with Brilliant is that The lessons can be bite-sized. They're really short, so I can fit them in my small like segments of downtime because I have a full-time job, I work on YouTube, etc. It's a lot of time taken, but I'm able to just like take a lesson and it's fun and it feels like so much better than like doom scrolling on social media. And I'm currently taking a course that I find absolutely insane and really cool, which is called Perplexing Probability. It's basically statistics problems where your intuition is probably going to be wrong, and they explain why, and it's fascinating and I love it. So like me, if you want to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you should visit brilliant.org/quivlazygeek or simply click in the link in the description. And the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Okay, now that this is done, let me talk quickly about my protocol for capturing those 1,000+ images on the Pleiades, and then stacking those exposures in multiple sets from 1 to 1,000+. This is something, by the way, that has been done by other YouTubers before. Nico Carver from Nebula Photos did it excellently a year ago or so. I'll put the link down in the description. We also have my friend Luke from the Lucomatico channel did it recently. I'll also put that in the description. What I thought I would add to the discussion would be how it looks like from a super light polluted city. And to show you how much it feels like more improvement can be gotten from here by just adding more and more data. I also want to make clear that I took all of those exposures last year, and I took actually in total I took 1,300, something like that, but I selected 1,024 exposures randomly. And then I mixed all of the images together, and this is because we have some images that are taken while the Pleiades are relatively low on the horizon, and so they have more atmosphere and light pollution to go through, and there are times when the exposure is taken when the Pleiades are high up in the sky, so the exposure quality in that case is higher. I wanted to make sure that each of my individual substacks had no advantage like that compared to the others, so I randomized all of my exposures, and then I took groups of exposure. 1 exposure, 4 exposures, 16 exposures, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, and finally 1,024 exposures. And each time I stacked them from scratch. And now that you know the protocol, we can look at the results. And here we are with our various stacks of multiple pictures of the Subaru Nebula, of the Pleiades cluster, of the Seven Sisters. So first, let's look at the raw stack. So we have 1 frame here. This is single exposure, single picture of 20 seconds of the Pleiades star cluster / reflection nebula. And yeah, I mean, we see the stars, we don't see much else, but, and I think this is very interesting because especially since it's from Tokyo, we start to see that this little like this thing there. And this is something that I really like with pictures like this, is the less you zoom in, the more you can see that there are patterns there around the stars. There's this kind of little haziness around the stars. So let's like zoom in a little bit and or make the picture bigger, and we can see there's also something here. It's just difficult to say what it is, but okay, single 20 seconds picture of the Pleiades, and we can see there is something. And to be fair, if you're going to go to a dark zone, just look at the Pleiades with the naked eye or even a pair of binoculars, and you'll be able to see that the star cluster looks fuzzy, and the reflection nebula is one reason. But okay, we have like 1 exposure here, it's full of noise, we can barely tell that there is nebulosity around the stars. What if we double the signal to noise ratio by going to 4 exposures? And by the way, all of those images, they were stacked from a series of 20-second exposures, randomized. And now let's have a look at the second picture, which is actually the stack of 4 pictures that I took of the Pleiades Nebula / star cluster. And what's very interesting here is because we went from 1 to 4 exposures, each 20 seconds each, we've quadrupled the number of exposures of the same length. So we've quadrupled the exposure time, meaning we have doubled the signal to noise ratio. And with this simple doubling, which took us just like 1 more minute of exposure time compared to 20 seconds, we already see so much more. We can see definite nebulosity here. We can see that there are details to the nebulosity. There are like streaks that are available or visible in the nebulosity here and there as well. There's some kind of weird reflection or artifact there. And we can see there's like nebulosity around this star that extends like in this direction as well. And this star is also slightly fuzzy. So we can start seeing a bit better what's happening because we have more signal to noise ratio available. We have doubled our signal to noise ratio compared to the first exposure, and that only took us 60 seconds to do. So that is a very efficient doubling of signal to noise ratio. But what if we want to double this again? Well, this time, if I want to double this from 4, I need to go to 16 exposures. So I need to take 12 more exposures. So I need to like make the huge effort of taking 4 more minutes of data. I think we can achieve that, right? So 4 more minutes and data gives us another doubling of signal to noise ratio. This is awesome. We can spend like such little time on this target and still manage to get so much better results from like 20 seconds to a few minutes of data here. We're having such a massive difference by increasing the signal to noise ratio by a factor of 4. And this is super exciting. Now, if we look, like the resolution of those stripes there is so much better than at the previous doubling level. I see so much more details in here. And let's look at this star here as well. You can see that the shape here has so much more resolution than before. And this is because we have more signal to noise ratio. We can also start to see much better another streak of light here and maybe something here as well. And we can start to see much better that the nebulosity extends to these two stars here. It extends to this lonely star here. And we see much better that this star has more nebulosity, that there's nebulosity extending towards like the top of the image or towards the central stars. And also we're starting to see that the tail of nebulosity here is much wider than we would have expected from here. And also it becomes more obvious that it is now a different kind of color. We have very blue color there, but the blue loses its intensity as we go further away from that very bright star, which is kind of normal for a reflection nebula, where you have like particles in space that are simply reflecting the light from nearby stars. And those stars, they're very young stars, very young relatively, and so they shine blue. And therefore the reflection nebula will reflect that blue light as well. I find this absolutely magnificent. But okay, we've doubled our signal to noise ratio twice already. What happens if we double it yet another time? Well, to do that, we need to take 4 times more exposures, which from 16 means we need to take 48 more exposures, which would be an additional 16 minutes of data. Okay, 16 minutes, that's doable, that's not a big deal, but you can see that we're getting into diminishing returns there. If we want to double the SNR, we need so much more data than we used to. Like our first doubling only took us 1 minute. But now that we're on the third doubling of SNR, it requires 16 minutes of work, 16 minutes of exposure time. But anyway, let's look at how it looks like. And now, oh wow, we're starting to get like some structure in here. We're starting to get even more structure here. It's like we see like streaks of light going from star to star. This tail here is getting more resolution. I can feel that there's stuff going on even in this darker area there. We're starting to see stuff. And let me put like the 16th right next to it. So we can see on the left 64, on the right 16. And yes, you can see the difference is like kind of night and day. And what the 16 didn't tell us, that the 64 exposures tells us, is that the nebulosity doesn't stop around the stars. There's no reason the nebulosity would be concentrated there only. It extends. You can see there's like weird milky patterns around the star cluster that look like grayish, not quite as dark as the rest. And on the 16 exposures, they might just look like noise, right? Noise that if we were to process this image, we would try to just get rid of. But when I look at the 64 exposures, it feels like there's indeed a pattern there. We're getting something more. This particular doubling of signal to noise ratio has allowed us to reveal more stuff around the nebula. So right now it's been like super productive. And compared to just like a single 20 seconds exposure, the difference is literally night and day. And yet this 64 exposures picture is equivalent to basically a 21 minutes long exposure. It's not a big deal. It's very easy to take even from Tokyo to get this image. It's crazy easy actually. And now we are really squarely entering into the realm of diminishing returns, because if I want to do another doubling of signal to noise ratio, again, I need to have 4 times more exposure time. That would be not 512 exposures as I previously had on the screen, sorry about that. It would be 256 exposures. So now, to get this doubling from 64 to 256 exposures, I had to take 1 hour and 4 minutes more data for a total exposure time of 85 minutes. So this 256 is roughly equivalent to 85 minutes single exposure on the Pleiades star cluster. But we've managed, with this additional hour of imaging time, to double our signal to noise ratio. So this is still pretty good, right? Pretty nice. And we can see like really good results there as well. I mean, look at this. We're getting from here to there, and now like this, the nebulosity at the center of the image is getting crazy detail, like from 64 to 256. Look at the additional details we're getting in the center. And towards the star at the bottom of the cluster there, we can see all of that nebulosity in so much more detail than we could with just 64 frames. Our doubling of signal to noise ratio really is paying off. And if I open the image a bit larger, we can see that here as well, we're getting details. We're getting like those hair strands there on the nebulosity, and a switch from that blue color and also that pale blue color here to something more reddish as well. It is absolutely beautiful. We also see those streaks of light here, getting more definition. And even more important than that, that nebulosity that we see on the outskirts, it's more visible. We can see it's there, even though it still looks like noise. We're getting surer and surer that this is not noise. This is nebulosity. So I find this absolutely amazing. Like, we've just added 64 minutes of data, and that lets us double the signal to noise ratio. So we've had 1, 2, 3, 4 doublings of signal to noise ratio. But now again, let's think of the diminishing returns. We now need to get 1024 frames in total to be able to double our signal to noise ratio from 256 to 1024. And that means that we need to take 4 additional, a bit more actually than 4 additional hours of data just to achieve another doubling of signal to noise ratio. But 4 additional hours is a lot. But the result, look at the result. The result is totally worth it. Like the center of the nebula at 256. Let's compare it to 1024. It's not even it's awesome. Look at all of the details we're getting in here. All of those streaks of nebulosity all over the place. This is amazing. And if we look here as well, there's so much more resolution, so much more detail, simply by exposing longer, by getting more and more pictures. And this is why, this is the answer to my question in the title. This is why I've taken so many pictures of the Pleiades star cluster. And also look at the nebulosity on the outskirts of the nebula. Let me put that full screen. This is now definitely nebulosity here. We're definitely getting some super cool results there, even though it is still kind of drowned in noise. But look, those arms of nebulosity, they extend towards that dark nebulosity on the outskirts of that reflection nebula. This is so amazing. This is so beautiful. All of the streaks of light, all of the streaks of nebulosity, aren't they absolutely gorgeous? Aren't they amazing? Wasn't it worth the 4 additional hours of data that we got on this object? It is so magnificent. And looking at this, it tells us like, yes, this additional doubling managed to give us such a better quality result. And we can also still see that there's a lot of room for improvement, especially on the outskirts of the Pleiades Nebula. So I would want to do yet another doubling of signal to noise ratio. But how would I accomplish that? If I wanted to do another doubling, which would likely start to properly reveal that dark nebulosity on the outskirts of the Pleiades, I would need to take another 17 hours of data. 17 hours. That would require multiple nights of imaging. This is where we can see the diminishing returns, and this is where being in a light polluted area is so painful, because if you were in a dark area, you'd have so much detail already that doubling the signal to noise ratio is almost worthless by then. But in Tokyo, in the city, there is still so much room for improvement, but to get that improvement, I need to expose for so much longer. And this is the tragedy. This is the absolute tragedy, the diminishing returns on those exposures. But still, with 1,024 exposures, I'm still very, very happy with the results that we're getting here. But now let's have a look at what would happen if I use recent AI-powered processes that have been made available to us. Now, AI-powered doesn't mean that we're inventing data. AI-powered here just means it was trained, like we have processes that were trained to do very efficiently a mathematical operation that normally would need to be done very manually. And it's not inventing new details, it's just enhancing our images using the information that's in them. And I have applied those processes, one is called Blur Exterminator, the other is called Star Exterminator, on our images, and let's see what the results are. You can see on the screen, we still have, like on one exposure, we see much less of the noise, but still we don't have that much more details, right? And after that single exposure, let's double it and let's look at how it looks like. And I've actually switched it over so that now we have the original 4 exposures on the left and the one with the AI processes applied on the right. And you can see there is quite a bit of a difference. We're able to pull out more details out of the image thanks to those AI-powered processes without inventing anything really, including like this kind of like curve here, which we didn't see earlier until maybe 64 exposures or so. So this is like really impressive to see the difference that we can get, or the additional details that we can get using those new processes available to us. Now let's do the same for 16 exposures that we have here. On the left is what we had previously with 16 exposures. On the right is what we get with those new AI processes. And what I find absolutely incredible is that with the AI processes, we're starting indeed to see luminosity and nebulosity in the middle, which we could barely make out without those new processes. And something that is absolutely incredible, all that weird noise on the outskirts of the image, with the AI processes we can tell that it is actually nebulosity, only with 16 20-second exposures. This is absolutely incredible. And such a big change from before. Now let's look at 64 exposures to double the signal to noise ratio again. And again, I'm putting our original image of 64 exposures on the left and then a new one after those AI powered tools on the right. And the result is the same. This is what we had originally, and now we see more details available all over the place, including that nebulosity on the outskirts of the nebula, including the structures here that are barely visible without applying the process, but is visible afterwards, simply because the stretching algorithm was able to, well, stretch its legs even more thanks to the lowered noise in the image. This is honestly mind-boggling. It's almost as if those AI processes were giving us like a doubling of signal to noise ratio, even maybe more than that, for free. And isn't that incredible? Although I feel like the gap between each of the AI corrected images is still pretty much similar to the gap that we had before. And now we're doing the same for the 256 exposures, and we can see the AI-powered tools again have played a very important trick on the image, but I feel like the enhancement that we're seeing is not as crazy as we saw in the original images. And I feel this is simply because we've collected enough signal to noise ratio right now that the image can stand upon its own merits without needing that little help by the AI-powered tools. Still, there is a noticeable increase in the amount of details that we get, simply because the stretching process is able to stretch more than before. And finally, I think this kind of conclusion is even more obvious on the 1024 exposures, where the two images are almost the same. It almost seems as if the image on the right just has slightly more contrast and not much more. Do we see much more details in here? We do see a bit more details in the AI processed image, but again, like the image on the left, our initial image before those AI processes can stand on its own. So I feel like those AI processes give us diminishing returns as well. The more light we capture, the more signal to noise ratio we have. And this is basically it. The jump from 1 exposure to 4 to 16 to 64 to 256 and to 1024. Each time doubling our signal to noise ratio on the broadband target from a super light polluted city. And yeah, my conclusion is being in the city is really terrible because we're still in an area where we want to double our signal to noise ratio, but to double our signal to noise ratio, we need so much imaging time. And the AI powered processes, which were very effective with lower signal to noise ratio images, become less effective because there's already so much detail in what we have gathered. So it's like, I feel even worse about being in Tokyo than I used to. Still, I am extremely happy with the image of the Pleiades that I've been able to get by doubling our signal to noise ratio again and again and again. And I wish I could double it yet again, but it's simply not feasible. I would need really to spend so many nights on the Pleiades. And would you spend that much time just to double the signal to noise ratio again? Well, let me know down in the comments. Leave a like while you're at it. Seriously, it really helps the channel. You can subscribe if you're new, in which case welcome. Click that bell icon so you're reminded when I upload a new video. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can join the channel as a member or join as a Patreon, link in the description. Because this video is longer than 20 minutes, we'll have the Patreon members' credits at the end of the video, together with the YouTube members. And also some Patreon tiers have access to my videos early and without ads. But again, more important than all of that, what are your thoughts on that? Is it exactly as you were expecting, from doubling of SNR to next doubling of SNR? Did you learn something? Is it unexpected? I really want to know. And if you've done a similar experiment, let us know the results as well. Again, this whole protocol was inspired by recent videos by Lucomatico and by a video from a year ago or so from Nico Carver Nebula Photos. And so links in the description, you should really check those videos out. But with that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.